mercy. Water cannot...
Attend to this decree at once.
For England and the Crown! Fetch the seal.
My soul I commit to God, my body to Saint Wulfstan.
Hey guys, tonight we will explore one of the darkest moments in English history together. Imagine this. It is October of 1216, when the air in Newark Castle is thick with the smell of damp stone, wood smoke, and something foul, the scent of illness, quietly spreading. In just 2 weeks, dysentery ravaged the army, knocking out over 30% of the soldiers, equivalent to more than 5,000 men, and at least 1,200 lives were lost, including elite knights, even on the battlefield. Amid the glory of war, the most powerful king, Lord of Ireland, Duke of Normandy and Aquitaine, Count of Anjou, was brought low by horrific spasms, not from sword or spear, but by that cruel sickness from within. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your local area right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Rewind time to October of 1216 in Newark Castle. The air was thick with the smell of damp stone, wood, smoke, and something fouler still, the scent of a plague creeping silently through the halls. In a chamber, flickering by torchlight, a man lay on a sweat-soaked bed, writhing in agonizing spasms. This was no ordinary soldier or unfortunate peasant, but King John of England, Count of Anjou, Duke of Normandy and Aquitaine, son of Henry II, and younger brother of Richard the Lionheart. Yet before that tragic moment, let us briefly review the journey of his life. John, christened John Lackland, was born at the end of 1551 at Beaumont Castle in England. During the reign of Henry II, he was the youngest of 4 children of Henry and Eleanor of Aquitaine, a formidable queen in her own right. John's family belonged to the Plantagenet dynasty, descended from Geoffrey of Anjou and Matilda, daughter of Henry I of England. His father, Henry II, was an ambitious king who had extended England's domains into Normandy, Brittany, and Aquitaine. His mother, Eleanor, linked English and French royalty, giving John an upbringing both grand and complex. John grew up amid internal disputes and wars with France. His eldest brother, William, died young. Geoffrey and Richard also faced illness or combat in their youth. Richard the Lionheart, his second brother, became legendary for his crusader exploits, praised as a heroic warrior. Meanwhile, John, nicknamed Lackland, lived in the shadow of his brother's achievements. He had few lands or titles of his own, and from an early age, he nursed an unrelenting ambition. In 1199, when Richard died from a crossbow wound at Chinon, John finally ascended the English throne, inheriting 7 kingdoms and vast European territories. He was 48 years old, fulfilling a lifelong dream. John's reign lasted a full 17 years, marked by major upheavals from catastrophic military defeats to Philip II of France losing Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Poitou to ceaseless conflicts with the English barons. During that time, he also commissioned and reinforced fortresses such as Château Gaillard on the Seine, demonstrating strategic foresight, despite enormous expense. John made notable contributions to the law he enacted, numerous tax statutes, recognized the barons' rights to trial and compensation, and established centralized financial offices to manage the royal treasury. Under his rule, administration became more organized. Roads and bridges in many regions were repaired, fostering commerce on the Thames and at local markets. These were rare bright spots in a reign, often judged harshly. However, alongside these helpful reforms, John left many indelible scandals. He imposed oppressive taxes, levying scutage 11 times, instituting inheritance and income taxes that burdened merchants and peasants alike. Barons had their lands seized, and children held hostage for ransom. He famously starved Matilda de Braose and her son to death in Windsor Castle's dungeon, leaving behind a scene of horror and endless outrage. Even the Church did not spare him conflict with Pope Innocent III led to England being placed under interdict for 6 years, suspending all religious rights, and John himself was excommunicated, rendered an outcast from Christendom. Such cruelty and arrogance spurred a broad rebellion. Barons, clergy, and commoners alike rose up. On June 15th of 1215, on the meadow of Runnymede, John was forced to seal the Magna Carta, a charter laying the groundwork for individual liberty and the limitation of royal power, though he initially annulled it. In the end, it was John's death that enabled the charter's reissue under Henry III, rescuing the kingdom from civil war. Returning to the dark chamber at Newark, the king, once feared throughout the Plantagenet realm, now fought for his life against dysentery, a horrific bloody flux that left him too weak to ride. Confined to a litter, enduring spasms like blades ripping his insides, contemporary chroniclers described his guts as if about to burst. A final reckoning of history for a ruthless ruler, and in that moment when a once mighty dynasty faced foreign diplomats and French armies, it was the invisible enemy, disease, that closed the tragic chapter of John, and in so doing, opened the era of rule of law and freedom for generations to come. Rewind a little further to trace the roots of John's restless ambition and the shadows that haunted his every step. John was born into the formidable household of Henry II under the mocking epithet John Lackland, for by the time of his arrival, the lands traditionally parcelled out to royal sons were long claimed by his elder brothers. From his earliest years, he nursed a desperate hunger for power, yet found the doors to inheritance stubbornly closed. While his eldest brother, Richard the Lionheart, rode off on crusade to the Holy Land, John stayed behind on English soil, weaving rumours of Richard's death and forging alliances with those who opposed his brother's cause. He spread whispers in court corridors, suggesting that King Richard had fallen in battle, and conspired with discontented nobles to seize the crown. When Richard was indeed captured and held for ransom on his return from the Third Crusade, John schemed to prevent his rescue, an audacious ploy that, predictably, collapsed in embarrassment. Richard returned triumphant, pardoning his younger brother's treachery, and John was unceremoniously cast back into the shadows of the royal family. By the year 1199, the battlefield claimed Richard's life with a fatal crossbow bolt, and at last John ascended the English throne. He stepped onto the throne at 48 years of age, fulfilling a lifelong yearning that had driven him since boyhood. Yet the crown proved more curse than coronet. Unlike his brother, John lacked martial prowess. When faced with the shrewd and capable King Philip II of France, he faltered. In a series of humiliating campaigns, John saw the ancestral lands of Normandy slip through his grasp, followed by the loss of Anjou, Maine, and Poitou territories that had once formed the proud expanse of Plantagenet power. By 1204, the English crown had been stripped of its continental dominions, leaving John's legitimacy hanging by a fraying thread. Military defeat alone was bitter enough. John compounded his misfortune with disastrous financial measures. To fund his ill-fated ambitions of reconquest, he turned to his own subjects with merciless extraction. He levied scutage, an unconventional substitute for knightly military service, no fewer than 11 times during his 17-year reign, a rate his three predecessors combined could not match in 6 decades. New taxes proliferated across the realm: levies on inheritances, burdens on merchants, even taxes on personal income. He squeezed every penny from peasant and peer alike. His barons, once loyal lords of vineyards and manors, found themselves stripped of lands on spurious charges, and their children held as hostages until hefty fines were paid. The coffers swelled with ill-gotten gains, only for John to pour the treasure into further military blunders. John's financial tyranny sowed misery across the kingdom. Villages once buzzing with market fairs fell silent under the weight of imposed levies. Merchants, unable to afford tariffs, shuttered their stalls along the Thames. Farmers, coerced into surrendering grain reserves to royal requisitions, watched their families starve. Even the nobility, accustomed to feudal privilege, recoiled at John's rapacious demands. Desperate appeals for redress went unheard, as the monarchy's financial machinery proved deaf to mercy. In the name of war and honour, John sanctioned widespread confiscations of property, turning his realm into a landscape of fear and resentment. Amid these trials, John authorized the construction and reinforcement of strategic fortresses, such as the grim Chateau Gaillard overlooking the Seine. Though these fortifications demonstrated a keen strategic mind, the astronomical costs further drained an already ravaged treasury. Each stone laid in these walls was paid for by the sweat and tears of his subjects. The king's vision of a secure frontier became another monument to his own obstinacy, emblematic of a ruler who pursued martial glory at the expense of his people's well-being. By the close of 1213, John's reign stood characterized by loss and grievance. The lands of his forebears were gone. The loyalty of his barons was fraying. The church, once an ally, bristled with hostility. Yet amidst the chorus of criticism, he still managed to enact glimmers of administrative order. He codified tax laws, standardizing procedures that later generations would refine. He recognized, albeit grudgingly, the rights of his barons to lawful trial and compensation for wrongs. He established a nascent system of central finance offices to manage the crown's revenue, a forerunner to modern treasury institutions. Such measures, however, could not extinguish the reputation of a king whose rule had inflicted so much suffering. The very name John Lackland became synonymous with avarice and oppression. His legacy, to his contemporaries and to posterity, was tainted beyond redemption. And yet, in the cruel theatre of history, it was precisely this once feared monarch whose downfall would usher in a new era, an ironic twist that would ensure John's memory endured, not as a triumphant conqueror, but as a cautionary emblem of unchecked ambition and the foundational impetus for the birth of constitutional liberty begin. Then, with the full weight of military disaster pressing upon King John's shoulders, transforming him from an ambitious sovereign into a merciless tax collector, the losses suffered on the battlefields of Normandy and Anjou left him desperate for funds to refit his armies. Thus he imposed scutage money paid in lieu of personal military service no fewer than 11 times throughout his 17-year reign, a sum that doubled the combined levies of his 3 royal predecessors. Each levy scorched the pockets of knights and barons alike, deepening their resentment. Not content with that, John devised new inheritance taxes, compelling heirs to bribe their way into their own patrimonies. He introduced levies on merchants' profits, on peasants' produce, even on common trades and pastimes. Nothing escaped his gaze. Manor incomes were audited to the last penny. Every hearth, mill, and millpond was assessed for additional dues. Villagers found themselves paying a toll simply to walk paths they had trodden for generations. Meanwhile, urban guilds saw their small earnings vanish under burdens, so arbitrary that many artisans abandoned their crafts. The barons, who once swore fealty and supplied knights to the royal host, They were treated as potential traitors, rather than partners in governance. If one dared to question the king's extractive policies, his children were seized as hostages, held in dank towers, while their estates were confiscated on spurious charges of disloyalty. The most chilling example was the fate of Matilda de Brose, wife of a prominent marcher lord. Having publicly accused John of murdering her nephew, the young Prince Arthur John's rival claimant, she and her eldest son were thrown into Windsor Castle's dungeon. For 11 days, they were given little more than a handful of raw oats and a strip of bacon. When the door finally creaked open, guards discovered a scene of unspeakable horror. Matilda, in her despair, had gnawed the flesh from her son's cadaver. No ransom demands, no parliamentary pleas could sway the king. His vengeance was absolute, a stark warning that resistance meant annihilation. Yet John's cruelty extended beyond temporal rivals. In a bid to control not only land but also souls, he locked horns with Pope Innocent III over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury. When Innocent refused to confirm John's nominee, the king retaliated by seizing church estates, farms, mills, and markets that provided vital church revenues. The confiscations stripped the clergy of sustenance, leaving abbeys and priories bereft of resources to feed the poor or maintain their walls. Monastic schools closed, and the aged monks and nuns were driven to rely on meagre handouts. The Pope's counterstroke was swift and devastating. In the year 1208, Innocent placed the entirety of England under an interdict. Church bells fell silent. Altars were stripped of vestments, and the sacraments, baptism, marriage, the burial were suspended. Imagine the terror of a countryside where dying infants could not be christened, and the corpses of loved ones could not be consecrated in hallowed ground. Faith, once a comfort in dark times, became a scarce resource. Priests, forbidden to speak God's word publicly, maintained secret masses in forests and cellars, while layfolk whispered prayers behind locked doors, fearing both royal reprisal and divine wrath. By the following spring, even these desperate measures failed to move John. In 1209, he himself was excommunicated, cast out from the communion of the church and damned, according to canon law, to eternal separation from Christ's body. No priest could absolve him. No liturgy could cradle his soul. The news travelled swiftly. The anointed King of England was, in the eyes of Christendom, a spiritual outlaw. Yet, far from humble repentance, John remained obstinate. He continued to demand tithes from defiant clergy and refused to seek reconciliation, alienating not only the barons and the commoners, but also the holy orders that once sprinkled his baptismal font. Thus, the Kingdom of England found itself trapped under a triple yoke: the weight of fiscal exaction, the anguish of sacramental deprivation, and the fear of divine judgment. Markets stagnated as trust in law evaporated. Roads fell into disrepair without church funding, and the countryside trembled under the dual spectres of famine and eternal damnation. The very air seemed charged with dread, as if the unseen force of moral outrage had manifested in the land itself. In this bleak tableau, John emerges not as the chivalric knight of legend, but as a figure consumed by avarice and pride. His methods, once calculated to shore up royal coffers, became a bludgeon to keep his subjects in line, until even his closest allies recoiled. The memory of his excommunication added a final layer of disgrace to his image. No longer merely a king, but an outcast to both his people and his God. And it is against this dire backdrop that the next chapter of his tragic story unfolds, one that will see the nation rise in rebellion, demanding the restoration of ancient rights and, in the end, the charter of their liberties itself. By 1215, John had descended into the deepest isolation of his reign. Barons, clergy, and common folk alike had grown weary of his ruthless exactions and arbitrary punishments. Noble banners that once bore witness to knightly oaths were now furled in silent protest. The abbeys, emptied of arms, and forced to close their doors, echoed with the whispers of monks who once prayed for his salvation, peasants, burdened by scutage, inheritance levy, and an ever-expanding roll of taxes on household goods, spoke of little else at market. Even the royal court, where courtiers once vied for a glance of the king, had emptied to a handful of fearful retainers. In that year of discontent, the realm simmered with a singular demand, reform or rebellion. Under mounting pressure, John was compelled to meet the assembled opposition on the meadow at Runnymede, beside the slow, stately Thames. There, on a gentle slope dotted with daisies and poppies, a document was presented for his seal. It was the Magna Carta, a charter of liberties drafted by his very barons, composed of 63 clauses. It declared that no free man should be imprisoned or stripped of his rights without a judgment by his peers or by the law of the land. It imposed limits on the king's ability to levy taxes at will, safeguarded inheritance rights, and affirmed customary dues. For a brief moment, the memory of John as a capricious oppressor seemed eclipsed by the promise of a new order, one where even monarchs answered to law. The barons, armoured in both plate and principle, believed their victory complete. They had restrained the king's overreach and enshrined checks against future tyranny. Yet John viewed Magna Carta not as sacred truth, but as a coerced concession to feudal resentment. Within days of affixing his seal, he dispatched a fervent letter to Pope Innocent III, his erstwhile adversary turned uneasy ally. In it, he portrayed the charter as an illegal usurpation of royal prerogative, an affront to the divine right vested in his person by God. He begged for papal intervention to invalidate what he called this shameful and unnatural agreement. Pope Innocent, now persuaded that the English crown should remain under his suzerainty, responded decisively. He issued a papal bull outright annulling Magna Carta, declaring it contrary to canonical law and harmful to Christendom. This papal decree unleashed a fresh wave of outrage among the barons, who saw their hopes dashed by the union of crown and church against their hard-won freedoms. Feeling betrayed by their king's collusion with a foreign pontiff, they renounced their oaths of fealty and cast their support behind a new champion, Prince Louis, eldest son of King Philip of France. Thus began the First Barons' War, a conflict that splintered the realm in two. Rebel banners rose from Sherwood to Salisbury, proclaiming loyalty to Louis as the legitimate ruler. John, his coffers still strained, faced this French invasion with the same desperation that had characterized his earlier campaigns on the continent. His armies, rife with disillusioned knights and depleted by disease, struggled to hold key strongholds. Meanwhile, Louis marched from Dover to London, welcomed by citizens eager to shake off John's yoke. The capital, once the glittering heart of Plantagenet power, fell into rebel hands with little resistance. The civil war that followed was brutal, yet inconclusive. Skirmishes flared in the Welsh marches. Castles changed hands by siege and sortie, and supply lines were cut by roving bands of men-at-arms. Amid this chaos, John resorted to ever harsher measures. He increased scutage, promised pardons for knights who rejoined his cause, and even seized church revenues once more to fund mercenary forces. But with peasants embittered by famine and clergy still under the shadow of interdict, his offers carried little weight. Loyalty became a currency more fragile than gold. By mid-1216, the conflict had reached a bleak stalemate. Louis's forces, overextended and reliant on uncertain alliances, were stalled at the edge of Windsor, while John, no longer welcome at Westminster, found himself a fugitive king in his own land. His health, already compromised by years of stress and indulgence, began to fail under the strain. Despite the turmoil, he refused to reopen negotiations on Magna Carta. To him, the charter was a blot on royal dignity. The rebels, however, clung to its principles as a beacon of hope. amid the din of steel and the groans of the wounded. It was in this crucible of war and repudiated treaties that John's legacy took shape. One might imagine a more prudent monarch recognizing the need for conciliation. But John's obstinacy burned brighter with each passing day. The countryside, racked by troop movements and marauding bands, bore witness to his failures as surely as the castle walls that once symbolized his power. Barons who had once raised their swords in his defense now sealed pacts with the Dauphin of France. Priests, once silent under interdict, openly preached rebellion from church pulpits, and the common people, already wearied by harsh levies, murmured that the earth itself seemed to cry out for a ruler more just. Through all this turmoil, the essence of Magna Carta remained a whispered promise, even as John's forces battered rebel strongholds. The idea that a king must govern within bounds gained traction. It carved a fissure in feudal absolutism that would not be easily sealed. Though the war raged on and would only conclude after John's death, it was this charter, initially forced from his unwilling hand and then nullified by papal decree, that shaped the future. In the lull between siege and skirmish, chroniclers noted how the words of that parchment travelled from camp to camp, a lullaby of legal restraint sung softly but persistently across the fields of England. And in that somnolent chant lay the seeds of a revolution in governance that would bloom long after the war's bloody end. A fateful turn came in October of 1216, when John decided to cross the tidal ford known as the Wash, a shortcut only passable at low tide. In the pale pre-dawn light, his army slogged across the mudflats, hobnailed boots sinking with each weary step. John himself rode resolutely at the head of his retainers, but behind him, the baggage train creaked ominously, laden with the king's treasure gold coins, jewelled chalices, and the ancient crown passed down from Alfred the Great. The wagons rumbled over the shifting mud. Then, with a sudden surge of water and quicksand, the tide turned, a wall of brackish flood swept in, swallowing horses, carts, and every treasured relic. Within moments, the wagons listed and lurched, then slipped beneath the waves, engulfed forever in the sucking mire. Only the distant clatter of harness and the cries of drowning men broke the eerie silence that followed. In that instant, centuries of royal accumulation vanished, never to be recovered, a poetic emblem of John's reign, where all glory and wealth seemed to vanish into the void. For the final 6 months of his life, John wandered the length and breadth of England like a ghost in flight. Rebel barons pursued him with grim banners, while French forces under Prince Louis shadowed his route. Autumn's chill bit through his cloak, and the king's mount grew tired, stumbling over fallen leaves slick with early frost. Wherever he halted, he found scant comfort. Inns were shuttered by fear, fields lay ravaged by war, and once loyal subjects looked away. Weariness and rage warred within him. One evening, he arrived at the Sisters' Monastery of Swineshead, a humble structure of stone and thatch set among windswept fens. There, seeking solace in what he deemed a modest feast, he consumed temptation, too great a hastily prepared meal of soft pears, freshly baked bread, and a draught of unfermented cider rumoured to be the pride of the abbey. By the next dawn, John's body rebelled violently. A creeping fever seized him, accompanied by wrenching cramps that twisted his insides like coiling serpents. The soup of his ministry, once a source of power, became his undoing as dysentery set in, merciless and unrelenting. Blood mingled with every spasm, leaving him too weak to mount his horse. Instead, he was carried on a litter, swaying over cracked causeways as the wind moaned through marsh reeds. His retainers, stoic men who had once cheered his proclamations, now exchanged anxious glances. Their own boots slick with mud and fear. The journey to Newark, once a matter of days, stretched into a delirious odyssey of blinding pain. On the 16th day of October, in the year 1216, John arrived at the gates of Newark Castle. He was scarcely recognizable, his face ashen, eyes sunken, his beard matted with sweat and the soil of unending travel. Guards supported his litter through the courtyard, where the torchlight cast long, flickering shadows across cold stone walls. For 2 days, he writhed on a pallet of straw, every muscle convulsing in waves of torment. Monks in their black habits hovered at the threshold, murmuring prayers he could no longer hear. Pain roared through him like a tempest, each breath a battlefield, each heartbeat a hammer strike. Despite the agony, John summoned the strength to perform the last duties of his station. With trembling hand, he directed the drafting of a final will, naming his 9-year-old son, Henry, as successor. He confessed sins before a weary chaplain, tears mingling with sweat as he invoked God's mercy. In delirium, he spoke of faces once wronged his captive hostages, the exiled barons, the monks of Lincoln. Perhaps in those fevered visions, he sought forgiveness, or perhaps he saw the spectre of divine judgment at his side. Then, under the pale glow of the 15th candle, the final convulsion passed, and John Lackland drew his last breath on the evening of the 18th. Chroniclers would later write of his death with grim satisfaction, describing how his insides seemed to burst forth, a metaphor for the uncontrolled violence of his affliction. But to those present, it was a moment of hushed awe. The man who had wielded iron and gold now lay vanquished by a sickness, his body as unrecognizable as his shattered legacy. In that somber chamber, the mighty king lay alone with his pain, surrounded only by the silent stones and the flicker of a dying torch. Outside, the war paused, as if the land itself drew a breath. News of his death travelled swiftly by torchlight, by foot messenger, and whispered by wind through hollow branches. The rebel barons, their banners momentarily furled, removed their helms in reverence or relief. The French invaders, faced with the innocence of a child king, faltered in their resolve. Thus ended the life of John, who had once marched with armies and stormed the gates of empires, only to be felled by an enemy invisible and merciless. His death, tragic and tinged with dark irony, laid bare the fragility of human power. No fortress, no treasure, no oath could defend against the relentless assault of nature's fury. And in that final twilight, as his spirit slipped away, the seeds of a new era quietly took root, the era of a king bound by law, of liberties wrested from tyranny, and of a charter that would outlast kings and crowns alike. A hush fell over the marshlands as John's weary host emerged from the boggy expanse of the Wash, his once resplendent banners hanging limp from splintered poles, the king's treasure gold coins, jewelled reliquaries, and the venerable crown said to descend from Alfred the Great had vanished beneath the churning tide, swallowed by the mud with no hope of recovery. The disaster left John pale and shaken, his shoulders heavy with silent fury. His knights, soaked to the bone and ankle-deep in sticky silt, shared his grim mood. Under a slate-grey sky, they trudged toward the distant silhouette of Swineshead Abbey, each footfall a muted lament for lost glory. At the abbey, venerable stones soaked with centuries of rain rose like mournful sentinels. Within its cloistered walls, John cast aside the formalities of kingship. He abandoned the stiff, fine-spun tunic of his court and relished a feast of orchard fruits and fresh-baked bread. Legend says he gorged himself on tart peaches, their skins still knobby with dew, and crisp pears glistening like morning sunbeams. He washed them down with rough-pressed apple cider, unfermented and faintly sweet, the liquid tang clinging to his tongue. In that reckless banquet, he sought to assuage the emptiness of defeat, his heart pounding with anger at both fortune and fate. But his mortal frame, already strained by endless pursuit and the dread of betrayal, betrayed him in turn. A creeping fever gripped him before dawn, and within hours savage cramps racked his belly. This was no simple indigestion, but a vicious dysentery bloody flux that tore at the intestines like unseen scourges. John writhed, clutching at his abdomen, as if attempting to hold himself together. Each spasm ejected blood, mucus, and waste with brutal force, painting the coarse linen sheets in dark streaks. He could neither mount a steed nor stand. His pride lay broken, reduced to a quivering ruin. John's loyal retainers fashioned a litter of rough-hewn oak and canvas, placing him gingerly upon its sagging frame. 24 men hoisted the poles onto their shoulders, shifting under the weight and the foul stench of his illness. The journey ahead stretched across rolling fields, now pitted with hoofprints and churned soil, the remnants of half-hearted skirmishes and plundered homesteads. A bitter wind sliced across the open land, cutting through cloaks and armour. Every jolt of the litter sent fresh waves of agony through the king's shivering body, each lurch like a blade twisting in his gut. As they laboured onward toward Newark, villagers peered from behind shuttered windows, their faces pale with both pity and fear. Whispers followed the litter. "There lies the tyrant undone by his own excess," they murmured. Elsewhere, a squire paused to offer a crust of stale bread, only to be waved away by a hand slick with sweat and shame. The thin wail of John's delirium drifted across hedgerows. He hollowed his cheeks in anguish, his eyes flickering with feverish visions, hostages starved in dungeons, barons in chains, the silent churches stripped of their altars. Each memory, real or imagined, stoked the fires of his guilt. For 2 days and 2 nights, the litter bore him across the ancient roads, rutted tracks lined with hawthorn and bramble. Moonlight filtered through ragged clouds as the bearers stumbled over ruts and relics of Roman waystations. At each village green, they paused only long enough to replace soaked bandages and scoop fresh water. But illness showed no mercy. Dehydration burned his throat, and the cold seeped into his bones. Borne along by stoic men whose faces were drawn with exhaustion, John faded in and out of consciousness, slipping between the fevered present and the memories of battles he had won or lost. On the 16th day of October, in the year 1216, the battered procession reached Newark Castle's stout gatehouse. At the sight of his fortress's grey walls, John's breathing grew ragged, as though hope itself had deserted him. The guards half lifted the litter, now caked in mud. Along the flagstones of the courtyard, torches flickered in the damp air, casting elongated shadows that danced like phantoms. John's strength, such as it remained, was summoned for one final act, securing the succession of his heir. With shaking fingers, he wielded a quill, stained by his own perspiration, marking his last will and testament. He named his 9-year-old son, Henry, as the rightful king, placing the future of England upon the shoulders of a child. As dawn stretched pale fingers across the sky on the 18th, John lay propped against rough-hewn pillows in the dim chamber. Monks huddled at the threshold, their prayers soft as the sigh of candle flames. He dictated confessions, naming wrongs against barons, clerics, and commoners alike, seeking absolution that only a merciful God might grant. Each breath came with a groan, each heartbeat a distant drum of lingering pain. And then, as the light grew stronger, the final spasm passed, and John Lackland exhaled his last breath. In the ensuing hush, the realm held its collective breath. The tyrant king, who had once commanded armies and sealed charters with proud flourish, was now silent. His journey from the Wash's drowned fortunes to Swineshead's fatal feast, from fevered convulsions to the weary trek back to Newark, had ended. No longer would his voice echo through court halls, nor his seal imprint parchment with edicts. Yet in the stillness of that chamber, a curious peace descended, as though the land itself had paused to mark the passing of a king undone by his own designs and by the relentless hand of fate. At Newark, the course of John's final days unfolded in a sombre chamber, lit by no more than 2 flickering candles. For 2 long days, he remained curled upon his litter, his body racked by relentless spasms, and his breathing shallow and ragged. His skin took on a deathly pallor beneath the wavering glow, as though the light itself recoiled from the sight. In his right hand, he clutched a quill so tightly that his knuckles turned white, guiding its tip across parchment in the last act of his reign. With each tremor of fever and pain, he inscribed his final will, naming his 9-year-old son, Henry, as the heir to the English throne. The document stood as both testament and plea. May this child rule better than his father had done. During fevered moments between delirium and lucidity, John made confessions that spilled from his lips in tremulous whispers. He spoke of Matilda de Braos's doomed resistance, her final moments gnawing at her son's lifeless body in that dark Windsor dungeon. He lamented the tears shed by her household, a sorrow he had wrought with cruel intent. In fleeting visions, he saw the stern visage of Pope Innocent III, whose papal decree had laid England under interdict, stripping away the sacraments and locking the faithful out of their churches for 6 years. The Pope's gaze, cold and unyielding, gnawed at John's conscience more fiercely than any earthly siege. As his strength waned and the quill fell from his trembling fingers, John beckoned the nearest chaplain to his side. The priest, robed in simple wool, administered the rites of confession and absolution with gentle voice. John, in a voice barely more than a wheeze, recited his sins, both the political misdeeds of forced levies and the personal cruelties that had stained his name. Each mea culpa trembled on his lips like a final benediction, a hope for some solace before the journey beyond mortal bounds. Around the litter, the king's loyal warriors gathered in hushed reverence. These were the men who had sworn oaths at his coronation, who had fought and bled for his banner, and who now, in stifled sobs, held his hand and murmured prayers. Their armour, once gleaming, was dulled by weeks of campaign and weather. Their eyes, once hard with martial fervour, now glistened with tears for a leader who had inspired both devotion and fear. They knew this was the last moment they would see him alive. This despot who had demanded their service, even as he bankrupted their estates and jailed their children. In those final minutes, the gulf between sovereign and subject melted away, leaving only the fragile bond of shared mortality. On the night of the 18th of October in the year 1216, John's life ebbed away in a final, shuddering convulsion. Chroniclers of the day, monks and clerks who later committed pen to parchment, described the scene with morbid satisfaction. His guts seemed to burst from within. They wrote, and his entrails gave off a noxious stench. Survive de toils, penned with harsh relish, were meant as moral lesson that a tyrant's body, so full of greed and cruelty in life, would be consumed from the inside. To these scribes, John's agonizing death was fitting retribution for a life marked by betrayal and brutality. When the final convulsion subsided and breath ceased in the king's chest, an almost imperceptible hush fell over the castle's inner ward. The only sound was the faint crackle of candle flames and the distant drip of water from mossy stones. It was as though the very walls of Newark exhaled a weary sigh, relieved that the torment had ended. Outside, in the great hall, the court clerk gently lifted the quill from John's hand, preserving the royal seal on the final decree. The child King Henry, though absent, became sovereign in that penstroke, a new chapter in England's tumultuous history. News of John's death spread across the countryside, like wildfire across dry tinder. Riders bearing torches galloped down muddy lanes, clattering hooves announcing the fall of the Plantagenet tyrant. In villages, cottages opened their shutters as villagers emerged to exchange shocked glances and murmur prayers of thanks. Barons, formerly resolute in demanding reform, paused in their plotting to remove spurs and share quiet toasts to divine justice. Many saw in John's death the hand of Providence itself, a sacred judgment upon a king who had flouted both secular and ecclesiastical law. By dawn, the rebel banners that once encircled London were furled, and the French Prince Louis, whose bid for the English crown had seemed so promising, withdrew toward the coast. The cause of rebellion, centered on Magna Carta, found new life under the regency of William Marshal and the innocence of little Henry. Suddenly, the rebels had what they sought, a king amenable to their grievances, and a charter vindicated by royal death. Within Newark Castle, the atmosphere shifted from the grim silence of mourning to an almost reverent calm. Monks prepared for midnight vigils, chanting psalms for the soul of John. Courtier, who had once feigned courtly loyalty, wept for the last time, dreading the uncertain future that lay ahead. Yet beneath their sorrow stirred a cautious hope that from the ashes of John's demise would rise a more just reign, guided not by capricious will but by the rule of law. Thus ended the final act of John's turbulent life. His body, once flanked by armoured knights in triumphal procession, was borne in an unadorned coffin to the priory church, where it was interred with the simple rites denied him in life by the interdict. In death, his bones rested among common brethren, at last stripped of the golden trappings of royalty. Yet even as the earth covered him, the legacy of his misrule endured both as warning and as foundation. For in the ache of his memory, England found the resolve to bind its kings to the laws they once broke, ensuring that no future sovereign could wield power without restraint. And so, in the hushed stone corridors of Newark and beyond, the tale of John's last days became a somnolent hymn to the price of tyranny and the promise of liberty. John's death did more than end a brutal reign. It somehow rescued the realm from the abyss of civil war. Those rebel barons who had once clamoured to overthrow John now paused, seeing before them not a tyrant, but a child, King Henry III, but 9 years of age. The notion of placing Prince Louis of France upon the English throne lost its allure in the face of this pale boy's innocence. In the wake of John's passing, William Marshal, stalwart commander, and the last of John's faithful, seized the moment. He hurried young Henry to Gloucester Cathedral, where, beneath vaulted stone arches, the boy was crowned in a makeshift ceremony. The regalia crown, orb, sceptre gleamed dimly in the morning light, while the gathered nobility bowed their heads, acknowledging him as their sovereign. It was a hurried coronation, yet its effect was profound. Both domestic rebellion and foreign ambition stalled before the sight of a child anointed at God's altar. Almost immediately, Marshal displayed boldness that belied his years at court. He reissued Magna Carta at Oxford, stripping from it the most radical clauses that had agitated baronial war, and yet preserving the Charter's essential promise that the king is not above the law, and no free man may be imprisoned without due judgment. The newly simplified Magna Carta felt less like a charter of revolt, and more like a pact of mutual respect. Barons, wearied by years of skirmish and disdaining further French influence, found in the child king, and this renewed charter, the rationale for peace. One by one, lords lowered their banners, recalled their levies, and pledged fealty to Henry. The alliance with Prince Louis, once fervent and defiant, unravelled like autumn leaves in a gentle breeze. The political landscape shifted, the foreign threat receding as domestic loyalty coalesced around the young monarch. Thus, in a twist of fate, John's ignominious end, a private agony of dysentery, became the unlikely catalyst for stability and the rule of law, the very instrument John had scorned. Magna Carta now served to bind his successor more firmly to justice. Under the regency of Marshal, Henry III's minority became a time of cautious reconstruction. Marshal convened councils to review royal finances, ensuring that scutage and arbitrary levies would no longer be tools of oppression. Revenue offices reopened with transparent ledgers, and tax collectors were admonished to heed customary rites before pressing men for coin. Church bells, silenced for years under papal interdict, began to ring once more across the countryside. Monasteries reopened their infirmaries, offering care to the sick and poor. Parish priests, once hounded by royal sequestration of church lands, regained their tithes and returned to ministering at baptismal fonts. The sacrament of baptism, denied to infants in the darkest days of interdict, was now a sacramental chorus, echoing hope throughout villages. Funerals, too, regained their solemn dignity. The dead were laid to rest, with rites proper and prayers uttered aloud, their souls entrusted to consecrated ground rather than abandoned to fear. As peace settled, daily life resumed a lullaby of routine. Market towns bustled once more. Merchants set out spices and cloth beneath painted overhangs. Farmers brought grain to mills, paying modest dues rather than oppressive tallages. Roads and bridges, neglected in years of war, were repaired by communal effort. Overseen by local justices, reaffirmed under the reissued charter, livery companies and guilds, once crushed under heavy exactions, thrived again, their apprentice-led workshops humming with the sound of hammers on anvils. In the castles of the marcher lords, banners no longer bore the fleur-de-lis of France, but the English rose, and the cross of St. George. Barons convened in councils to advise the young king, marshalling their retinues, not for rebellion, but for border defence. When King Louis's forces retreated across the Channel, they left behind a lesson. A realm united under a lawful crown is stronger than one fractured by greed and foreign intrigue. Through the winter months, John's legacy was a whispered warning rather than a battle cry. Chroniclers, once eager to blame every misfortune on the tyrant's name, began to record Marshall's reforms and Henry's baptisms. Poems circulated in abbey, scribal rooms, comparing the dark days of arbitrary rule to the dawn of chartered liberty. In manor halls, lords taught their sons of the young king's ascension, linking it inseparably to the reissued Magna Carta. Thus, from the ashes of despotism, England emerged with new foundations. Though the child Henry could not yet speak for himself, his reign, initiated by a regent of honour, ushered in a lull of governance that balanced royal prerogative with baronial rights. The kingdom's pulse, once erratic with war and extortion, settled into a steady rhythm, and so, in the sleepy hush of post-war England, one could almost hear a collective exhale, a sigh of relief that centuries of strife might yet yield a more just and tranquil future. In the year following King John's death, the forces of France, under Prince Louis, found their position growing untenable in the face of united English resolve. Initially welcomed as liberators, these foreign knights and men-at-arms soon discovered that their alliance with disaffected barons was a brittle thing. English lords, long chafing under John's heavy exactions, realized that they had little to gain from substituting one master for another. To pledge allegiance to a French prince, who would doubtless treat England as a mere fief of France, seemed a bitter irony. Instead, a youthful Henry III, crowned under the newly reaffirmed Magna Carta, offered them a pathway to actual power. Under the Charter's provisions, they could exercise local authority, secure their inheritances, and participate in the governance of the realm. The promise of shared rule, a book of liberties balanced by a king who could not tax or imprison at will, proved far more appealing than the prospect of becoming junior partners in a French dominion. By the close of 1217, Louis's strength had all but evaporated. His banners, once flown high above London, were hastily lowered as he retreated toward the southeastern counties, the very ground he had hoped to hold, slipping from beneath his feet. Political support withdrew as swiftly as military aid. English barons, who had raised troops in his name, now recalled them, extinguishing campfires and sending their soldiers home. Spies and envoys carried word of shifting allegiances, and Louis found himself stranded in Kent. his supply lines severed, and his coffers empty. At length, his pride wounded, he withdrew to the coast and embarked for Normandy, leaving behind only a tale of ambition, undone by a people's willingness to reclaim their own destiny. The final, crushing blows to French ambitions came in the campaigns of 1217. In the spring, William Marshal, regent and tactical genius, mustered the young king's forces at Lincoln. Laden with banners of red and white, the royal host marched northward under the grey skies of late March. There, near the city's ancient walls, Marshal's knights met the French garrison in what is now known as the Battle of Lincoln. With disciplined cavalry charges and well-timed flanking manoeuvres, they overwhelmed Louis's troops, sending them scattering among the Lincolnshire fens. The sight of English knights pressing home their advantage, shield to shield, convinced even the most wavering barons that the cause of Henry III was just, and the Charter's promises worth defending. At sea, the conflict reached its denouement at the Battle of Sandwich in August of the same year. Admiral Hubert de Burgh, his sails snapping in the Channel wind, led a hastily assembled fleet of royal ships to intercept French reinforcements. With crow's nests crowded by archers and decks bristling with billhooks and axes, the English vessels struck swiftly. Grappling hooks secured French ships alongside their own, and men-at-arms flooded across the gangplanks. The clang of steel rang out as French sailors, confused by sudden assault in unfamiliar waters, were driven back. Within hours, the sea was strewn with debris and overturned boats, and the surviving French hastened back to harbour in despair. With that naval victory, all hope of resupplying or reinforcing the invasion force vanished, and Louis's cause was sealed in ignominy. In the wake of Lincoln and Sandwich, the War of the Barons drew to a close, and England stepped into a fresh era of renewal. The winter snows fell silently upon battlefields, still scarred by hoof and plough. But within royal precincts, a different kind of rebuilding began. At Westminster and Oxford, scribes recopied the Magna Carta into bright new charters, their parchment pages bearing the inked seals of lords who now pledged fidelity to a child king and to the rule of law. The issuance of clear statutes and the restoration of customary dues gave rise to a cautious but steady revival of commerce. Market towns reopened their stalls, with merchants once again free to trade without fear of capricious tolls. Inns and hostels filled with travellers, their barrels of ale no longer taxed into oblivion, allowing for a modest prosperity to return to innkeeper and artisan alike. Within the royal palaces, workmen laboured to repair shattered chambers and collapsed roofs. Great halls that had served as mustering grounds for war were refitted with new tapestries depicting the coronation of Henry III, a young face surrounded by barons and prelates under a gilded canopy, though the actual jewels and relics carried off in that ill-fated crossing of the Wash were lost forever. The spirit of regal pageantry lived on in fresh finery and in the careful ceremony of court. Chambers once reserved for John's private council were rededicated for the meetings of the King's Council, now composed of lords and knights whose seats were earned through chartered accord rather than royal favour alone. Administratively, the early years of Henry III's rule under Marshal's guidance saw significant reforms. The Exchequer, once a secretive archive of royal dues, opened its ledgers to appointed auditors, trusted knights and clerks, tasked with ensuring fair collection. The outdated scutage payments were curtailed, replaced by more consistent and transparent levies. Approved by the Great Council, revenue from customs on wool and wine was harnessed to fund the maintenance of roads and bridges, rather than being siphoned off for war. In the countryside, 100 courts and shire courts resumed regular sittings, hearing cases, large and small, from land disputes to accusations of poaching. The impartial administration of justice, enshrined in Magna Carta's clauses, restored faith in the Crown's role as arbiter rather than oppressor. The Church, too, regained its footing. Lands seized under John's interdict were returned to abbeys and priories, allowing monks and canons to reopen their infirmaries and hospices. The revival of ecclesiastical education in cathedral schools fostered a slow flowering of learning, ensuring that future scribes and scholars would be trained in philosophy, theology, and law. Bishops, once marginalized by royal hostility, now served as key advisors in the young king's council, balancing spiritual counsel with temporal governance. Thus, the shattered edifice of John's rule was gradually reassembled, each stone set with the mortar of Magna Carta's principles. In the hush that followed the clangor of war, England found itself reborn, not as a realm ruled by whimsy and force, but as a nascent kingdom of laws and liberties. The child Henry, wrapped in simple robes at his coronation, came to symbolize a promise that a monarch might indeed rule in partnership with his subjects, rather than above them. And in those greeted drowsy hours of peace, one could almost hear the gentle murmur of a land learning to sleep again, its dreams woven from the Charter's clauses, and its hope kindled by the memory of a tyrant's final, failed grasp at power. Yet the greatest legacy of John's folly, Magna Carta, did not remain confined within England's green pastures. In the 13th century, each successive monarch found it prudent to reaffirm the Charter, issuing quiet proclamations that renewed its force as law. Thus did 63 clauses, born of baronial revolt, slowly transform into a stable framework of governance. Year after year, by candlelight and seal, kings swore that they too would answer to statutes higher than their whims. The notion that even a sovereign might bow to the rule of law took firm root. No longer could a ruler impose arbitrary levies, nor condemn a free man to death, without the due process of a jury of his peers. This seed of legal restraint spread beyond the confines of the British Isles, drifting across the Channel to the courts of France and the Holy Roman Empire. Scholars in Paris translated excerpts of the Charter, marvelling at its insistence that justice be neither bought nor withheld. In the courts of Cologne and Bologna, jurists debated its principles, weaving them into commentaries on Roman and canon law. From these hallowed halls, the idea travelled further still to the fledgling universities of Oxford and Cambridge, where students mulled over the balance between royal prerogative and individual rights. Under torches in dusty chambers, future statesmen absorbed the Charter's lessons, unaware that they were forging the intellectual bonds of a wider civic consciousness. Century later, across an ocean whose waves carried the hopes and fears of colonists, Magna Carta became a vital touchstone for the architects of what would become the United States of America. In the turmoil of 1776, when 13 colonies declared independence from British rule, the Founding Fathers invoked the Charter's language in their Declaration of Independence: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, echoing the ancient clauses guaranteeing protection from unjust imprisonment. When drafting the United States Constitution and its Bill of Rights, these visionaries looked back to Magna Carta's insistence on due process and the right to trial. They borrowed its spirit, embedding in the new republic safeguards against cruel and unusual punishment and excessive bail, ideals rooted in an English charter born of baronial conflict. Meanwhile, in continental Europe, the Charter's resonance found fresh voice in the upheavals of 1789. The French National Assembly, swept up in revolutionary fervour, published the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. In its preamble drifted the ghost of Magna Carta, urging that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Indeed, the document's insistence on legal equality, protection of property, and limitation of sovereign power were direct descendants of that medieval compact. From Paris's Tuileries to Vienna's Hofburg, liberal thinkers pointed to the Charter as proof that centuries of tradition could yield the principles of modern human rights. In the aftermath of 2 world wars, as nations sought to bind themselves to ideals that transcended borders, the United Nations Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 drew upon the same ethos. Everyone has the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. proclaimed the drafters words that would have felt familiar to any baron standing on Runnymede meadow. The global community embraced the concept that no authority, no matter how grand, may deny fundamental freedoms without due cause. Thus, Magna Carta's ripples washed across continents. From the corridors of New York's UN headquarters to the benchrooms of The Hague, with a bitter irony, John Lackland, the very man who had forbade free expression, levied crushing taxes, and starved hostages into compliance, became, in death, the unwitting father of liberties that now define modern democracy. His name, once synonymous with tyranny, was transformed over centuries into a symbol of the perils of unchecked power. History painted him as the archetype of absolute rule's inevitable decay. Yet, in his demise, lay the fertile ground from which the doctrine of limited government and individual rights sprouted. Generations have come to regard Magna Carta not merely as a medieval relic, but as a living covenant between rulers and the ruled. It reminds us that the arc of justice, though sluggish, bends toward accountability. When citizens raise their voices to demand fairness, they stand upon the shoulders of those 13th century barons. When judges weigh indictments, they draw strength from a charter that declared, "No man shall be imprisoned without lawful judgment." When parliaments convene debates on taxation, they do so under the charter's legacy that taxes must be consented to by the people's representatives. Thus, from a grim October in 1216, when a king writhed in agony far from courtly splendour, emerged a document of profound and enduring significance. John's last, reluctant signature penned the beginning of a journey that would stretch far beyond his earthly dominions. His dreadful death by dysentery became a portent of tyranny's self-destruction and a prelude to the birth of constitutional government. Though John himself could never have fathomed the import of his surrender at Runnymede, his unwilling concession seeded an idea that, over centuries, matured into the bedrock of human rights. And so, in tranquil moments when the world hums softly around us, we owe a drowsy nod to John Lackland's paradox, a ruler undone by cruelty, yet immortalized as the inadvertent architect of liberty. The death of King John at Newark did more than extinguish a brutal reign. It marked the dawn of England's slow journey toward recovery. The night of October 18th, 1216, passed in an almost crippling hush. Within the castle walls, torches guttered, and shadows stretched long upon damp stone. John's loyal household, those who had borne the crushing weight of his heavy-handed taxes and the horror of his ruthless demands, bowed their heads in solemn relief, even as tremors of uncertainty flickered in their eyes. Word of the king's passing spread swiftly. Riders galloped along muddy lanes. Bells tolled in distant keeps, and villagers whispered behind drawn curtains that the king had finally paid his due. Yet among the older nobility, seasoned by years of plotting and palace intrigue, there lingered a cautious dread. If tyranny had fallen with John, would the realm tumble into chaos, without a firm hand to guide it? Enter William Marshal, celebrated warrior and confidant of Henry II and Richard the Lionheart, who now assumed the mantle of power. Without hesitation, he orchestrated the hurried coronation of young Henry III at Gloucester Cathedral. By candlelight and beneath soaring stone vaults, the boy, barely 9 years old, was anointed with holy oil, his hand encircled by sturdy knights. This spontaneous ceremony conferred immediate legitimacy upon the minor king, shoring up the crown's claim against any lingering designs of Prince Louis of France. On the chessboard of politics, the move was masterful. Many barons who had once rallied behind a foreign pretender now recognized that a native child king could be guided perhaps more pliably by the Regency Council than a prince schooled in continental courts. As rumours of Marshal's swift action rippled through England, support for Louis dwindled. His banners quietly lowered as the prospect of a Norman-style vassalage lost its appeal. In the tense weeks following the coronation, Marshal turned his attention to the very charter that had so infuriated John Magna Carta. At Oxford, he called a gathering of barons and prelates to reaffirm the charter's core ideals. This reissued version, while dutifully excising the most radical clauses concerning feudal jurisdictions and peculiar aristocratic privileges, retained the Charter's essential truths. No free man could be stripped of liberty or property without lawful judgment by his peers. And the Crown's power to levy extraordinary taxes would henceforth require the consent of a great council. The redrafted Magna Carta found favour among the nobility, who had fought and bled under John's oppressive levies. Now, with its stipulations secured, they saw in the Charter a binding covenant that anchored royal authority to the rule of law rather than to the king's caprice, even as the boy Henry remained too young to understand its significance. The Charter provided Marshal and the magnates with a durable foundation upon which to rebuild royal governance. Across towns and hamlets, the public mood shifted as swiftly as autumn leaves in a gentle wind. Only weeks earlier, angry mobs had hurled stones at John's garrisons and shouted curses at his name. Now, the sound of church bells, silent for years, under papal interdict, echoed through market squares and manor yards. Clergymen, once stripped of their spoils, resumed baptisms and funerals with solemn dignity. For the common folk, returning to the ritual rhythms of faith, offered solace after a reign of spiritual deprivation. Monasteries reopened their gates, offering alms and hospitality to pilgrims and poor alike. Villagers who had endured confiscatory tax collectors felt a lightness in their pockets as harsh fines were rescinded or reduced. With tithes restored to the church and customary feudal dues clarified, rural economies gradually healed. Fields once left fallow for lack of seed, and seed corn returned to cultivation, and carts laden with grain rolled again toward bustling towns. In the royal household, the transformation was tangible. Great halls, stripped of tapestries and echoing with disorder under John's regime, were refitted for administration and ceremony rather than for war councils. Civic charters were reissued under the young king's seal, granting boroughs more autonomy in holding markets and electing officials. Marshal convened councils not as a tyrant, but as regent and protector, consulting barons and bishops in matters of justice and finance. The exchequer, burdened for years by John's secretive accounting, reopened its tallied ledgers to appointed auditors. These men recorded scutage payments and customs duties in clear columns, ensuring that royal revenues funded public works rather than private wars. Roads and bridges, neglected for so long beneath John's distorted priorities, were soon earmarked for repair. With labour contributions drawn from tenant communities in lieu of arbitrary tolls, amid these reforms, England's courts began to embody the Charter's promise of impartial justice. 100 courts met regularly, hearing disputes over land and allegations of theft with the attendance of local juries. Shire courts assembled to try more serious offences with the young king's justices on the bench, ensuring that no man could be imprisoned without formal indictment. It was not a perfect system, Regency. Periods often teetered between patronage and principle, but the strides made in those early months of Henry III's reign represented a stark contrast to the capricious decrees of his father. Thus, a kingdom once convulsed by taxation and power struggles found itself drifting toward order and reconciliation. The tragic death of John, marked by solitude and agony, cast a long shadow. Yet that darkness also cleared the way for an era anchored by law and custom. In the quiet aftermath, one could almost hear a lullaby rising from the fields and valleys, a gentle reminder that a ruler's legitimacy rests not on fear alone, but on the consent of those he governs. And so, as autumn gave way to winter in 1216 and early 1217, England took its first somnolent steps toward a future where kings would learn to rule within the bounds of Magna Carta's solemn promise that even sovereign power yields to the enduring strength of justice. After the turmoil of succession and the initial sparks of civil war, England witnessed a decisive military triumph against the French invaders. In April of 1217, beneath ashen skies, the Battle of Lincoln unfolded. William Marshal, seasoned commander of renown, alongside regional captains and levy lords, intercepted the garrison left by Prince Louis's lieutenants. The clash began with the thunder of catapults and the shriek of steel as English knights, better equipped and buoyed by the cause of a newly crowned king, charged the French lines. The air trembled with the roar of horns and the cries of men-at-arms. Yet time and again, the English shield wall held firm. Cavalry squadrons swept in from the flanks, shattering enemy formations, while archers loosed volleys of arrows that darkened the sky. By sunset, the field was strewn with the banners of defeated foes. The French forces, exhausted and leaderless, fled toward the city walls in disarray. Lincoln's stout defense, once held by foreign gallants, now open to welcome Marshall's men as liberators rather than conquerors. Not long after Lincoln, the war shifted to the sea lanes. At the port of Sandwich, a fleet of French ships laden with soldiers, horses, and fresh supplies arrived under the hope of turning the tide back in Louis's favour. But Admiral Hubert de Burgh, commanding England's nascent Royal Navy, struck with swiftness and cunning English vessels, smaller and more manoeuvrable, feinted windward before sweeping in to grapple the larger French ships. The decks became battlegrounds, where mariners and marines fought amid heaving rigging and shattered oars. Within hours, French ships burned or drifted wrecked upon the sands, their crews either rescued as prisoners or lost to the waves. With their supply lines severed and reinforcements cut off, the remnants of Louis's army could no longer sustain the campaign. These twin victories on land at Lincoln and at sea at Sandwich did more than reclaim border towns. They crushed Prince Louis's ambitions. Nobles who had once lent him reluctant support now abandoned his cause, seeing that a foreign crown would render them mere vassals rather than partners in governance. The rising sentiment that England must be ruled by an English king grew irresistible. Barons who had drawn swords in Louis's name now offered oaths of allegiance to young Henry III. Reassured by Marshall's Regency and the guarantees of the newly reissued charter, by year's end in 1217, Louis was compelled to negotiate a peace, signing a treaty that withdrew his forces from English shores in ignominious retreat. With that accord, civil war ended, and the throne of Henry III stood secure, guided by the steady hand of William Marshall during the boy king's minority. Institutionally, this period of calm enabled far-reaching reforms in finance and administration. Taxation, once arbitrary and secret, was reformed under clear statutes that stipulated when and how the crown might demand coin. The Exchequer, long a shadowy archive of royal dues, opened its ledgers to appointed auditors drawn from the baronage, ensuring transparency and accountability. The Council of Barons emerged as a formal advisory body composed of regional lords who guaranteed a check on the regent's decisions. No royal edict could impose extraordinary levies without council consent, curbing the kind of fiscal rapacity that had defined John's reign. A parallel transformation took root in law. The common law courts, once diffuse and inconsistent, began systematic compilation. Itinerant royal justices brought uniform procedures to shire and hundred courts, recording precedents that would form the backbone of jurisprudence. Petty disputes and grand felonies alike received their public hearings, with juries of local men sworn to weigh evidence fairly. Over time, these written records, copied in scribal script, circulated among judges and clerks, laying the foundation for an English legal tradition that prized impartiality and due process. Culturally, the kingdom experienced a renaissance of faith and learning. Monasteries and priories, restored to their full privileges after years of royal seizure, resumed their roles as centres of education and charity. Monastic schools reopened, admitting not only the sons of nobles but also promising youths from merchant and yeoman families. In cloistered scriptoria, monks recopied manuscripts of scripture, classical philosophy, and medical treatises, preserving European knowledge for future generations. Libraries, once dusty collections of vellum scrolls, expanded with newly commissioned works on theology, law, and natural philosophy. The restored autonomy of the Church allowed abbots and bishops to preach again in parish churches, reviving liturgical life and reinforcing moral guidance. The return of church bells became a symbol of communal renewal across village greens and urban squares. The deep toll of Sanctus belfries at dawn reminded the faithful of the sacred order now safeguarded by law. Baptisms, once forbidden or interdict, were celebrated with water and prayers that welcomed new souls into the Christian fold. Funerals, accompanied by hymns and incenser smoke, closed the cycle of life with dignity, renewing villagers' sense of continuity and belonging. In this confluence of reform, legal, fiscal, and cultural England stepped away from its darkest chapter. The rubble of John's despotic legacy was pieced back together, brick by chartered brick. Under the aegis of Henry III's minority and William Marshall's stewardship, by the close of 1218, the kingdom resembled less a land under military occupation and more a society bound by mutual obligations, king to baron, baron to commoner, and lord to church. In the quiet hours following daily toils, one might hear a gentle murmur rising from hearth and hall, the lullaby of recovery, softly sung by a realm learning to trust again in the power of law, the shelter of faith, and the promise of a better dawn. In the years that followed, the reign of Henry III, spanning from 1216 through 1272, steadily matured, characterized by a delicate balance between royal authority and baronial council. In the earliest phase, under the vigilant stewardship of William Marshall, successive renewals of the Magna Carta forged a pattern of legal reaffirmation at crucial junctures, first in 1217, then again in 1225, and once more in 1230. Each reissue responded to shifting political currents, yet always preserved the Charter's core promise that no king would rule without respecting the law and that free men would not face arbitrary confinement. This ritual of renewal, almost annual in cadence, established a legal tradition without precedent in medieval Europe, one in which monarchs solemnly swore to heed their barons, and where the jury system, embryonic yet burgeoning, began to guarantee fair trials conducted by peers rather than by royal fiat alone. As Henry advanced from childhood into youth, the direct interventions of the baronial council, known formally as the Council of Barons, gradually receded, yet the spirit of the rule of law endured. Landmark cases, such as the dispute known to chroniclers as the Great Corruption Trial of the Duchy Court and the estate controversy between the earldoms of Norfolk and Cornwall, were heard in open court. Their proceedings, carefully recorded by clerks whose quills danced upon fresh parchment, set precedent for equitable judgment. These public resolutions encouraged the rise of professional jurists, clerks, and legal scribes, whose mastery of drafting writs and statutes would come to define the English legal tradition. Word of these recorded judgments spread beyond the realm's borders, inspiring neighbouring kingdoms to consider similar codifications. Abroad, the spectre of French invasion faded, but vigilance along the narrow stretch of water, known as the English Channel, became paramount under Henry's reign. The foundations of what would be called the Royal Navy took shape. A standing fleet of patrol vessels was established to guard against invasion, each ship provisioned with fresh sails and barrels of tar to repel storms and enemy boarding parties alike. Key ports Dover, Sandwich, and Portsmouth saw their quays extended and fortified. Warehouses stocked with timber, rope, and armaments. These improvements allowed for swift mobilization of troops and supplies at a moment's notice, ensuring that any renewed French ambition could be met with a unified maritime defence rather than a scattered flotilla of ad hoc levies. On the home front, this stability fostered an economic renaissance. Coastal and riverine trade along the Thames surged. A merchant ships bearing cloth, wool, and wine plied the waves between bustling towns. Local fairs, once disrupted by the ebb and flow of conflict, again dotted the calendar, drawing farmers, artisans, and traders from miles around. The improved security and reasonable customs duties encouraged peasants to till their fields and weavers to pluck fleece for the loom. Confident that their labours would not be taxed into ruin, grain, cheese, and ale flowed more freely, and market towns blossomed into centres of commerce, where deal-making under open arches became a vivid part of daily life. From these revived markets emerged a distinct middle stratum merchants, craftsmen, and burgesses whose growing prosperity gave rise to fresh political aspirations. No longer content to remain silent producers of wealth, they began to demand a voice in the governance that shaped their livelihoods. Their contributions to royal coffers became increasingly significant, and with this financial leverage came the notion of representation. It was thus that, in the year 1258, for the first time in English history, elected delegates known as burgesses were summoned to attend Parliament. These delegates came from shires and boroughs, adding their voices alongside barons and prelates to advise the king on taxation, law, and policy. Their presence marked a subtle yet profound shift. The seeds of wider participation in government had been sown, eventually blossoming into a fuller parliamentary democracy in centuries to come. Within the palace walls and council chambers, Henry matured into his kingship. Guided by the lessons of his infancy, he presided over sessions where statutes were debated and enacted, often in the presence of knights and townsmen alike. The Exchequer, now an instrument of transparent revenue collection, provided remitted accounts, showing exactly how taxes funded road maintenance, bridge repairs, and port defences. The jurisprudential records, compiled from dozens of county courts, offered a repository for judges to draw upon when setting new rulings, ensuring consistency and predictability in judgments from Cornwall to Northumberland. Meanwhile, the Church, its earlier wounds from John's conflicts now healed, assumed a collaborative role. Monastic schools inspired novices and lay students alike, teaching grammar, logic, and the rudiments of law. Cathedral song rose once more in great abbeys. Celebrating the dual renewal of faith and civic order, bishops, freed from years of royal exactions, supported charitable works, founding hospitals and hospices where both noble and peasant found care. The ringing of bells at vespers and matins reminded villagers that spiritual life offered stability and solace, even as legal structures took root. Thus, by the close of Henry III's formative decades, a kingdom once at the brink of collapse had evolved into a realm defined by equilibrium among monarch, nobility, and commons. The successive confirmations of Magna Carta underscored that royal edicts could not stray beyond the bounds of consensual law. The embryonic jury system delivered justice administered by neighbours rather than edicts. Maritime défense stood, ever vigilant against invasion, and economic revival empowered a robust middle order whose voice would grow ever louder in Parliament. In tranquil evenings, when the flicker of lanterns illuminated both manor and merchant's house, one could almost hear the faint hum of contentment, a dream of civic partnership born from the shadows of despotism and nurtured by the Charter's enduring promise of liberty and justice. The greatest legacy that John Lackland inadvertently bequeathed to posterity was none other than the Magna Carta and the very foundation of the rule of law. Throughout the 13th century, successive monarchs from Henry III through Edward I and into the reign of Edward II regularly reaffirmed the Charter, each reissue reinforcing its authority as the bedrock principle limiting royal power. Whenever a king attempted to levy taxes without consent or to wield arbitrary judgment, the barons would stand forth with parchment in hand, citing the Charter's sacred injunctions. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned, or stripped of his rights or possessions, or outlawed or exiled, except by lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. They invoked its guarantee that to no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay, right or justice, demanding an end to unjust confiscations, and the assurance that justice would flow through a jury of peers rather than the whim of the crown. Over time, the ethos of Magna Carta permeated beyond England's verdant fields. During the 17th century, English colonists in North America carried the Charter in their hearts as a shield against the perceived despotism of King Charles I and his successor. In sermons whispered in meeting houses and pamphlets distributed in port towns, patriots declared that taxation without representation is tyranny, echoing the Charter's insistence on consent before levying dues. By the eve of the American Revolution, these principles had crystallized in the colony's collective consciousness. When delegates convened in Philadelphia in 1776 to draft the Declaration of Independence, they enshrined the Charter's spirit in their grievances that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, and that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness were unalienable rights. Later, when framing the United States Constitution in 1787, and its first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights in 1791, the founders explicitly drew upon Magna Carta's commitments to due process, trial by jury, and protection from unreasonable searches and seizures. On the opposite side of the Atlantic, the ferment of revolutionary fervour in France found inspiration in the same medieval covenant. In 1789, as the National Assembly assembled beneath the tricolour flag, its members produced the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. There, in Articles 7 through 9, they echoed Magna Carta's clauses: no man shall be accused, arrested, or imprisoned except in the cases determined by law, and every man is presumed innocent until he has been declared guilty. The Charter's insistence on legal equality, protection of property, and the subordination of rulers to law became rallying cries in the streets of Paris, carried on the voices of sans-culottes and liberal nobility alike. The impulse toward human rights continued to radiate outward across centuries. In 1948, delegates at the United Nations gathered to pen the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, declaring that everyone has the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law, and that no one shall be subjected to arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile. These words, though uttered under electric lights far removed from Runnymede open meadow, were nonetheless descendants of the Charter that had first insisted 800 years earlier that the law, and not the will of a solitary sovereign, must govern society. It is a striking irony that John Lackland, once the epitome of unchecked authority, should, through his reluctant agreement and subsequent demise, have sown the seeds of modern liberty in life. He had thwarted free expression, imposed burdensome taxes, and meted out cruelty with callous indifference. Yet, in the Charter he dismissed, he unwittingly granted future generations the means to resist tyranny. Over time, Magna Carta evolved from a feudal contract into a universal emblem of the balance of power, a shield against monopolistic authority, and a protector of human dignity. Today, the principle that no one shall be deprived of liberty or property without due process of law resonates in the highest courts of democratic nations and in the treaties that bind the global community. From the European Convention on Human Rights to regional pacts in the Americas and Africa, the Charter's fingerprints lie beneath the texts that guarantee freedom of assembly, fair trial, and protection against cruel punishment. When citizens protest unlawful detentions or challenge excessive fines, they act in the spirit of those barons who once stood in defiance of a tyrant's exactions. When judges cite precedents requiring jury trials and transparent proceedings, they uphold a tradition begun on English soil. Thus, the story of King John and his infamous 47th chapter of Runnymede has become a somnolent lullaby of justice, a gentle reminder that even in the depths of oppression, the promise of the rule of law can endure. As the world sleeps beneath electric streetlights and digital screens, the quiet hum of that promise persists, carried in the whispers of courtrooms and the resolutions of parliaments, and in those tranquil moments before dawn. One can almost imagine the barons gathering on the misty meadow, the king's reluctant seal pressed upon parchment, and the soft echo of their creeds reverberating still, cradling the dream of liberty in a world wide and ever awake. The story of King John's tragic death and unexpected legacy, though it occurred many centuries ago, still offers profound values and messages for us today. First, it reminds us that power cannot stand above the law. Anyone, even a king, who abuses authority will face the judgment of history and public opinion. Through Magna Carta, we learn that no one shall be imprisoned unlawfully, and justice must come from a jury of one's peers, are not mere formalities, but the foundation of a just society, where everyone is protected from tyranny. Second, this story affirms the power of collective resistance when a community unites to defend its rightful interests. Nobles, clergy, and commoners alike dared to stand up to an autocratic regime, forcing the king to listen and concede. This demonstrates that solidarity and persistence in defending freedom are vital, even when opposing the most formidable forces. Third, the lessons from John Lackland's reign underscore the importance of responsibility and integrity in leadership. A leader's duty is not only to protect the realm, but also to care for the well-being and rights of all members of society. When authority is abused for personal gain, resentment accumulates, leading to crisis and upheaval. Conversely, a transparent government, accountable to its people, fosters lasting stability and prosperity. In our turbulent 21st century, the principle of the king under the law has evolved into government accountable to the people and every individual protected by the law. As digital technology explodes, privacy rights, freedom of expression, and access to justice face new challenges. Yet the spirit of Magna Carta remains timely. No one's rights may be arbitrarily taken, and all decisions affecting personal liberty or property must follow fair, transparent procedure. From this video, we learn that history is not merely a dry sequence of dates, but a treasure trove of lessons for the present. John's death, a personal tragedy of illness and abuse of power, sowed the seeds for the modern concepts of human rights and the rule of law that we enjoy today. Although the narrative may feel soporific and bleak, its lesson is profoundly awakening to build a better society. Each of us must respect the law, protect one another's freedoms, and continually strive to uphold justice for all.